So all of us are called to imagine something different. We're called to create a community of kinship such that God, in fact, might recognize it. We're invited to imagine a circle of compassion and then imagine nobody standing outside that circle. We're invited to dismantle the barriers that exclude. I like what Martin Luther King says about church. It's not the place you come to, it's the place you go from. And same thing about tonight's talk. This is not the place you've come to, it's the place we go from. And we try to reimagine something different. Mother Teresa diagnosed the world's ills correctly when she suggested that the problem in the world is that we've just forgotten that we belong to each other. So how do we stand against forgetting that? How do we inch our way out to the margins? Because if you stand at the margins, look under your feet, the margins are getting erased precisely because you chose to stand there. And you stand with a particularity. You stand with the poor and the powerless and the voiceless. And you stand with those whose dignity has been denied. And you stand with those whose burdens are more than they can bear. Every once in a while, you get this real privilege to be able to stand with the easily despised and the readily left out, with the demonized so that the demonizing will stop, and with the disposable so that the day will come when we stop throwing people away. I suspect if creating a community of kinship happened to be our goal, we would no longer be promoting justice, we would be celebrating it. So we go to the margins and we brace ourselves because the world will accuse us of wasting our time. But the prophet Jeremiah writes, "In this place of which you say it is a waste, there will be heard again the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voices of those who sing." So you go to the margins and other voices get heard. Well, none of that makes any sense, I don't think, unless you have a notion of God that's spacious and expansive. I'm a Jesuit, so the St. Ignatius of Loyola always talks about the God who's always greater. How do we land on that God? Because we settle for a puny, partial God, a lesser God, maybe a more realistic God. But the God we actually have loves us without measure and without regret, is huge-spirited. And we want to arrive on that because we all get stuck with a kind of a arrested development when it comes to God. We get stuck in the third grade. I don't know why that is. And we're always being invited to go from here to graduate to a higher grade. Meister Eckhart, who was a theologian and a mystic who died in 1348, I think, he said this thing. He said, "It is a lie, any talk of God that doesn't comfort you." I think that's the God we actually have. I had a spiritual director years ago who said, we need a better God than the one we have. He was a Jesuit, but of course he's right, because we've settled for this puny guy, because we've created God in our own image. My friend Anne Lamott always says, you've created God in your own image when God hates the same people you do, And I think that's the way it works, so we have to be careful. A handful of months ago, I buried my 92-year-old mama, and she had 8 kids. I'd buried my father like 25 years ago, but she had 8 kids and a slew of grandkids and a lot of great-grandchildren, and she died in her own home, and she wasn't one bit afraid of dying. At all. In fact, she was kind of oddly exhilarated by the whole thing. She said to me a couple weeks before she died, "I've never done this before." And it's something you might say before skydiving, And In fact, her last words to me were the day before she died. I was sitting by her bedside, and she woke up and she saw me and she said, "Oh, for crying out loud." Well, she was pissed that she was still alive, and sorry I can't help you there, but, and she was sharp as a tack even to the end. I mean, in the last year of her life, she watched so much MSNBC, she was becoming Rachel Maddow, and I was so privileged to actually be by her bedside the next day, and at noon, right at noon, it was just me. A couple of my sisters went out and got some lunch, and it was just the two of us. And right at noon, she just went, "Oh," this wondrous, glorious, amazing kind of gasp, skydiving. And she left us. And nobody in earshot of this sound could ever fear death again. But I tell you all that to tell you this. In the last couple weeks of her life, we'd be standing around her bed, 2 or 3 or 8 of us, her kids. And she'd be in and out of consciousness, and she'd wake up and then she'd lock on to one of us. And she'd look at us and say with breathless delight, "You're here. You're here." And after I buried her, I realized that is the only agenda item on God's list. That's it. God just wants to look at us with breathless delight and say, "You're here. You're here." And then you notice the notice of God. And then you receive this tender glance of God. And you have no choice but to be that tender glance of God in the world. And it is a lie, any talk of God that doesn't comfort you. The homies are always teaching me everything of value. And a lot of times they do it by way of mangling the English language, which I always love, and it's always illuminating. I had a homegirl named Lisa, who was a trainee in our 18-month training program, a gang member. She wanted to introduce her man to me, so she came in and she said, "This is my sufficient other." And I said, "No doubt." And we're a huge operation, Homeboy Industries, but we always struggle. We're a $22 million annual operation. Half of that comes from our businesses, but the other half we have to raise. It's a heavy lift, trust me, so I will appreciate any love offering at the end of this event. But it's tough, but it's nice to be able to have a CEO, so he's been taken over so I don't have to worry as much as he has to about meeting payroll and all that kind of stuff. So my favorite one, and it has most to do with the point I was earlier making, I'm saying Mass at San Fernando Juvenile Hall, actually the place that Jerry was referencing. And in those days we were in the gym, and so we had 500 gang members in the gym. And so I'm vested, I'm wearing my album, my stole, and I'm sitting on the little folding chair, and I said, well, I'm gonna close my eyes and listen to the word proclaimed by the homies who come up and read. And we had these little sheets that had readings in English and Spanish, the translation, and so I had it resting on my lap. And the first guy got up and he did the first reading, and then the second guy got up to do the psalm, and there was something in his voice. It was kind of an overabundance of confidence. And he gets up and he says, "The Lord is exhausted." And I get the sheet, I say, and it was "The Lord is exalted." And I remember thinking at the time, wow, that's way better. Because if you think about it, every person in this church and outside of it, if you were God, trust me, we would all want to be exalted. It's just, obviously that's God created in our own image. But what if our God is exhausted? What if our God is extensive and spacious? And no, it's not about me. I just want to look at you and say, you're here. You're here. We do need a better God than the one we have. And if your God is not the same as it was in third grade, congratulations, because that's the way it's supposed to be. But, if that's true, why wouldn't your notion of God be different tomorrow than it was yesterday? It should. Granted that God is unchanging, but our sense and consciousness is always changing. When we were in the third grade, we thought it was this, and oh my God, and you've disappointed me again, and you again, and then you discover that God doesn't want anything from you. God only wants for you, which isn't so hard for parents to understand, because you don't want anything from your kids. You just want them, you want for them. My joy yours, your joy complete. That's what you want. How do we receive the tender glance of God and then be that tender glance of God in the world? And God's dream come true is that we be one, as Jesus says. And we want to bridge any distance that exists between us and others. Even in service, everybody does service, and service is a good place to start. But you don't want to end there. Service is the hallway that gets you to the ballroom. You want to get to the ballroom, which is the place of exquisite mutuality, where there is no us and them, just us. That's God's dream come true. At Homeboy Industries, I'm not the great healer, and those gang members over there are in need of my exquisite healing. The truth be told, we're all a cry for help. We're all in need of healing. It's one of those things that connects us together as members of the human family. One of the great privileges of my life was knowing Cesar Chavez as a friend. And he was the best listener I've ever been in the presence of. He was laser beam focused. He was never looking over your shoulder, anticipating somebody more important. He was the tender glance. But once famously, a reporter had commented to him and said, "Wow, these farm workers, they sure love you." And Cesar just shrugged and smiled and said, "The feeling's mutual." And of course, that's the goal. Because even in service, there's a distance. Service provider, yes, service recipient. A hardcore gang intervention worker in Houston, after a talk I gave, he's a former gang member working with gang members in the streets, and he came up to me and says, "How do you reach them?" Meaning gang members. And I said, "For starters, stop trying to reach them. Can you be reached by them?" And that turns the whole thing upside down. You don't go to the margins to make a difference, because then it's about you. You go to the margins so that the folks at the margins make you different. And that's what's supposed to happen. And you don't want a distance between service provider and service recipient. So no homie in our 30-year history found more job opportunities than this guy we all called Dreamer. I knew him since he was a little kid growing up in the projects, got into a gang like his older brothers. No kid is seeking anything when he joins a gang, always fleeing something, no exceptions. He's doing well now. He's in his 40s and home and married and kids and a good job. But in his early 20s, he was kind of a yo-yo, in and out of being locked up, and I'd find him a job in the private sector or in one of our businesses, but then he'd always gravitate back to vague criminality, usually something involving drugs, the sale of or the use of, and then he'd wander back to me. So this was a pattern that was very frustrating and repetitious. So this one time he finished a 4-month stretch of probation violation at county jail, and there he is sitting in front of my desk, and he says what gang members often say, "This time it'll be different." I go, all right. So with him sitting there, I picked up the phone. I called a friend of mine named Gary, who runs a vending machine company in Alhambra, California. And Gary had hired homies in the past. I'm hoping against hope maybe he'll do it again. And sure enough, Gary says, yeah, you tell that guy he can start tomorrow. That's a holy man right there. So Dreamer began work the next day at the vending machine company. Well, 2 weeks later, there he is again in front of my desk. I couldn't believe my eyeballs. I said, Híjole, Madre Santa, here we go all over again. But this time he reaches into his pocket and he pulls out his first paycheck and he says, damn, gee, this paycheck makes me feel proper. I mean, my mom, she's proud of me, and my kids, they're not ashamed of me. And you know who I have to thank for this job. And I said, well, gosh, who? And he looked at me strangely and he said, well, God, of course. And, oh, sure, no, that's right. That would be God. You thought I was going to say you. I said, no, gosh, God's number one. You are so lucky we're not living in them Genesis days. I'm sorry, them Genesis days? He goes, yeah, because God would have had struck down your ass already by now. Well, I guess he told me, well, the two of us, we fell out of our chairs. We were howling with laughter. And I defy you to identify exactly who's the service provider, who's the service recipient. It's mutual. In the covenantal relationship of God and God's people, this exhausted God who loves us more than we can ask or imagine, God says, as I have loved you. Now, the God created in our own image would say, love me back. But that's not what is in the covenantal relationship. It says, as I have loved you, so must you have a special preferential care and love for the widow, orphan, and the stranger. And God identifies these subgroupings of the poor, if you will, as folks who God believes know what it's like to have been cut off. And because they have suffered in exactly this way, God thinks these are our trustworthy guides to lead the rest of us to the kinship of God. So we don't go to the margins to make a difference. We go to the margins so that the widow, orphan, and stranger make us different. And then pretty soon we inhabit our own nobility and our unshakable goodness, which is always there. So Homeboy was started a long time ago, 1988, when I was pastor of the poorest parish in the city of Los Angeles, Dolores Mission, nestled in the middle of two public housing projects, Pico Gardens and Aliso Village, largest grouping of public housing west of the Mississippi, 8 gangs at war with each other, highest concentration of gang activity anywhere in the city, according to the LAPD, was my parish. So I buried my first young person killed because of this sadness in 1988 and buried my 225th a week ago Saturday. So we did a lot of things. We started a school because there were so many junior high, middle school age gang members who had been given the boot from their home school. Nobody wanted them, so they were wreaking havoc in the middle of the day. They were writing on the walls, they were selling drugs, they were violent. So I walked out to them and I would isolate them and I'd say, hey, you know, if I found a school that would take you, would you go? And to my surprise, every single one said, yeah, you know, I would. And then I couldn't find a school that would take them, so that kind of forced my hand. So across the street from our church is our elementary school, grades K to 8, first 2 floors. Well, the entire 3rd floor was the convent. And so I gathered all the nuns together in the living room. They were 9 Belgian nuns. And I sat them down and I said, hey, you know, would you guys mind moving out, and we could turn the convent into a school for gang members. And I'll never forget, they looked at each other and they went, sure. And that was the entirety of their discernment process. And we were off and running. Gang members came in large numbers to our church property, which created a disconnect. People in the parish started to say, hey, wait a minute, aren't churches supposed to be hermetically sealed? Good people in and bad people out, which was a good gospel challenge. So, and then they said if only we had jobs, and myself and the women in the parish, we marched around the factories trying to find felony-friendly employers, and that wasn't so forthcoming. So we started things, a crew, maintenance crew, a landscaping crew, a crew to build our child care center, all made up of rival enemy gang members. In 1992, after the unrest, after the Rodney King verdict, the whole city of Los Angeles exploded, every pocket of poverty, except the poorest parish. And so LA Times wanted to know why. So they asked me, and I said, I think it's because we have 60 strategically hired enemy rival gang members working side by side in 4 different little businesses. And they had a reason to get up in the morning and a reason not to gangbang the night before, and a reason, more to the point of your question, not to ignite their own community. So that article appeared in the LA Times. Well, the next day, a movie producer named Ray Stark, who happened to have $500 million, summoned me to his office, and he said, how shall I spend my money? As I look back now, I recognize that I woefully undershot my request. I was young, so I said, well, why don't you buy this abandoned bakery across the street from the school? It's got ovens. I don't know, we could put hairnets on rival gang members. They could bake bread, and I don't know, we'll call it Homeboy Bakery. And he said, sure. And a month later, we had Homeboy Tortillas in the Grand Central Market. Once we had plural, we changed our name from Jobs for Our Future to Homeboy Industries, as if there was any industry involved in this. And your father was absolutely essential. It wouldn't have happened without Rob Smith. Absolutely would not have happened without him. And so, but not everything worked, and your dad remembers this more than anybody because he was the first guy on my board. Not everything worked. Homeboy Plumbing really was not hugely successful. Who knew? People didn't want gang members in their homes. Did not see that coming. And nobody ever intends to do such a thing, but we evolved our way, we backed our way into becoming, now we're the largest gang intervention, rehab, reentry program on the planet Earth. We never... So there are 120,000 gang members in LA County, 1,100 gangs, 15,000 folks a year walk through our doors trying to reimagine their lives. They all want to be a part of the 18-month program, as these two guys are involved. It's about healing. An educated inmate may or may not go back to prison, and an employed one may or may not return to prison. But we have an absolute guarantee at Homeboy: a healed gang member or returning citizen will not ever go back to prison. So healing is kind of the main thing, where they find a sanctuary, a place for some rest from their own chronic toxic stress, as both Jerry and Jesse talked about. And then they become the sanctuary they sought there. And then they go home and they present this sanctuary to their kids, and for the first time ever, a cycle is broken. So we have therapy, free tattoo removal, we have case management, navigators, we have all our classes, anger management, and lots of 12-step programs, and about how many, Jess? 60 classes, something like that. Lots of them. And we have all our businesses, our training programs, solar panel installation training program, Homeboy Bakery, Homeboy Silkscreen, Homeboy Homegirl merchandise, where we sell our logo stuff. Homeboy Diner, the only place you can get food at City Hall. We have a restaurant at LAX Terminal 4, American Airlines Terminal. We have a thing called Homeboy Grocery, where we sell chips, salsas, and guacamole at all the Ralphs and all the the Gelsons. We have farmers markets. We have Homeboy Recycling, where we do e-waste, and Homegirl Cafe, where women with records, young ladies from rival gangs, waitresses with attitude will gladly take your order, and they cater. It's breakfast and lunch, so if you go there, chances are you're going to run into some celeb, a movie star or elected official. Jim Carrey's been there many times, Jack Black, Forrest Whitaker, Jane Fonda was there a week ago, and once, with only 2 hours' notice from the Secret Service, Vice President Joe Biden, who was vice president at the time, wanted to have lunch at the famous Homegirl Cafe while he was in LA, and so motorcade, entourage, Secret Service, selfies with Uncle Joe, and I wasn't there. I was making my annual silent retreat, so when I got back, Louis Mora, one of the homies there, gave me a debrief. While you were gone, we were visited by an MVP. Sorry, an MVP? Do you mean a VIP? Yeah, that one, a VIP. Yeah. Imagine, here at Homeboy, we were visited by the Vice President of the United States, Mick Romney. Mick Romney. I think you can file that under all white guys look alike, I think we added a current affairs course shortly thereafter, but anyway, most famously of all, Diane Keaton showed up, movie star, Oscar winner, Godfather movies, Annie Hall. Her waitress is Glenda, and Glenda's a big girl, been there, done that, tattooed, gang member, felon, has no idea who Diane Keaton is. And so Diane Keaton says, well, what do you recommend? And Glenda rattles off the 3 dishes she likes the most, and Diane Keaton says, well, I'll have that second one. That one sounds really good. And it's at that moment something dawns on Glenda. She looks at Diane Keaton, she says, wait a minute. I feel like I know you from somewhere, like maybe we've met. And Diane Keaton decides to deflect it humbly. Oh gosh, I don't know, I suppose I have one of those faces that people think they've seen before. And then Glenda goes, no, now I know. We were locked up together. Yeah, that just took my breath away when I heard about it. I don't believe we've had any further Diane Keaton sightings, now that I think of it. But suddenly kinship so quickly, Oscar-winning actress, attitudinal waitress, exactly what God had in mind, and as I mentioned earlier, that you may be one. That's it. That's God's dream come true. I suppose he could have been more self-referential, but he doesn't want it to be about him. He wants it to be about us. All of us are called to be enlightened witnesses, people who through your kindness and tenderness and focused, attentive love return people to themselves. At Homeboy, we're kind of allergic to the notion of holding the bar up and asking the homies to measure up, because our exhausted God doesn't ask us to measure up. Why would we do it? Instead, we hold the mirror up and tell people the truth. That you are exactly what God had in mind when God made you. And then you watch folks on the margins as they become that truth, as they inhabit that truth. And no bullet can pierce it. No 4 prison walls can keep it out, and death can't touch it. A great many Buddhist texts begin with these sweet words. O nobly born, remember who you really are. But at Homeboy, we always know that part of the task is you have to reach in and dismantle the messages of shame and disgrace that get in the way, that keep people from seeing their truth. For indeed, the principal suffering of the poor throughout history and throughout Scripture is shame and disgrace. In the Acts of the Apostles, they have this odd kind of floating line that says simply, and awe fell upon everyone. And that awe somehow is the measure of our health. If as a community we feel awe at what the poor have to carry rather than judgment at how they carry it. You know, I give a lot of talks, and so many years ago, I was invited to speak to 600 social workers in Richmond, Virginia. It was what they call a gang-in service. They have these for social workers, 9 to 5, a hotel ballroom. Let's explore all the gang stuff. And so they invited me, and I figure, maybe I'll give a keynote, or I'll speak at lunch, or I'll close the day. And I bought my ticket, and I said yes. Well, a week before I was to fly, I pulled out the letter, and to my horror, I discovered that I was to be the only speaker from 9 to 5. And so I invited two homies in, Andre and Jose, both part of our 18-month training program. They're like a year in. I sit them down, and I said, look, at the end of the week, you're flying with me to Richmond, Virginia. I'd like you to get up in front of 600 social workers and tell your stories. Take your time. Well, I'd never heard their stories before, and Jose gets up first. He's 25 years old, a gang member, been to prison, and in his 18 months, he kind of found his way into our substance abuse team and became a real valued member of the team. He was a man solid in his own recovery, and now he was helping younger homies with their addiction issues. And a gang member, been to prison, tattooed, but he also had a long stretch as a homeless man and an even longer stretch as a heroin addict. And so he gets up in front of 600 social workers and he says, I guess you could say my mom and me, we didn't get along so good. I think I was 6 when she looked at me and she said, why don't you just kill yourself? You're such a burden to me. Well, 600 social workers did what you just did. They audibly gasped. And he says, it sounds way worser in Spanish. And I've never seen this happen. We really got whiplash going from gasp to laugh. I think I was 9, he continued, when my mom drove me down to the deepest part of Baja California. And she walks me up to an orphanage. And she knocks on the door. And the guy comes through the door and she says, I found this kid. And she left me there for 90 days until my grandmother could get out of her where she had dumped me, and my grandmother came and rescued me. My mom beat me every single day of my elementary school years with things you could imagine and a lot of things you couldn't. Every day, my back was bloodied and scarred. In fact, I had to wear 3 t-shirts to school every day. First t-shirt, because the blood would seep through. And second t-shirt, you could still see it. Finally, the third t-shirt, you couldn't see any blood. Kids at school, they'd make fun of me. Hey, fool, It's 100 degrees. Why are you wearing 3 t-shirts? And then he stopped speaking, so overwhelmed with emotion, and he seemed to be staring at a piece of his story that only he could see. And when he could regain his speech, he said through his tears, I wore 3 t-shirts well into my adult years because I was ashamed of my wounds. But now I welcome my wounds. I run my fingers over my scars. My wounds are my friends. After all, how can I help heal the wounded if I don't welcome my own wounds? And awe filled everyone. The measure of our compassion lies not in our service of those on the margins, but only in our willingness to see ourselves in kinship with them. For the truth of the matter is that if we do not welcome our own wounds, we may well be tempted to despise the wounded. I was interviewed once on the Christian Broadcasting Network, and a woman was asking me what do you do at Homeboy Industries? I told her all the things I told you, from tattoo removal to job training to healing to a place of tenderness to classes in case management and therapy and a place where gang members can find rest and rediscover that they're nobly born. I went on like that, and then she looked at me and she kind of made a face and she said, yeah, but how much time do you spend each day at Homeboy, praising God? And I didn't know what to say, so I said, all damn day. And I don't think she liked that answer very much. But it begs this question: what kind of praise does our exhausted God have any interest in? And I'll end with this, because it's hot in here. It occurs to universities mainly to force their students to read my books against their will. And I'm not complaining, but Gonzaga University, my alma mater in Spokane, Washington, forced the incoming freshmen to read Homeboy of Tattoos on the Heart. And so they invited me to go up there and speak a Tuesday night, a big venue, 1,000 people. And I said, sure. And they said, can you bring 2 homies with you? And so, and I always bring them if people are going to pay, and I always pick homies generally in the same way. I pick homies who are rivals, enemies, just to force them to share a hotel room just to mess with them. And I always pick homies who have never flown before just for the thrill of seeing gang members panicked in the sky. And but once I was at LAX and we were flying to Washington, D.C., and I had 2 older vatos, older guys, and honest to God, one of them, dead serious, said, hey, gee, are we flying Virgin Airlines because it's our first time? Dead serious. I said, well, yes, actually it's a requirement, and we'll be coming home on American. So I picked 2 homies, Bobby, an African-American gang member who at the time worked in our bakery, and Mario, who at the time worked in our merchandise store. I've done this thousands of times, honest to God, men and women. I've never picked anyone like this guy, Mario. I've never picked anyone more absolutely petrified of flying than Mario. In fact, he was hyperventilating, And we hadn't even boarded the plane yet. So we're at Burbank Airport, in a small airport in big bay windows, Southwest Airlines, and they don't have that hermetically sealed chute to board the plane. You walk out onto the tarmac like you're the president, and you climb up the steps, the front of the plane, and the big feature at Burbank, of course, are the steps at the back of the plane. And I'm sitting there with Mario, and Bobby's off somewhere walking, and our plane arrives. It's early morning, and people are deplaning. And I said, Mario, that's going to be our plane. And I think, wow, it's freaking me out, like maybe he'll die before we climb those stairs. And then I see our flight crew. I see the pilots and our flight attendants. And there are two flight attendants, females. Both of them have very large cups of Starbucks coffee. And they're schlepping up the front steps to get into the plane. And Mario goes, when are we going to board the plane? I said, as soon as they sober up the pilots. There they go now. Perhaps I shouldn't have said that. So I should tell you that in our 30-year history, Mario is about the most tattooed individual who's ever worked there, which is really saying something. And so he's all sleeved out, covered in tattoos, neck blackened with the name of his gang, head shaved, covered in tattoos, forehead, cheeks, chin, eyelids. And his eyelids say, the end, so that when he's lying in his coffin, there will be no doubt for anybody. So I'd never been in public with him, and I'm trying to calm him down. We're walking in the airport, and people are like this, when mothers are clutching their kids a little more closely. And I'm thinking, wow, because if you were to go to Homeboy tomorrow and ask anybody there, of the hundreds and hundreds who work there, quick, who's the kindest, most gentle soul who works here, they won't say me, they'll say Mario. He sells baked goods in the cafe. Mario is proof that only the soul that ventilates the world with tenderness has any chance of changing the world. So we get to Gonzaga, and it's always the same story. You get a big talk Tuesday night with 1,000 people. What they don't tell you is they have 93 other talks that they have told, that they've planned and haven't told you about. So this class, this meeting. So I tell Mario and Bobby, I'm not going to speak in any of these. I'm going to sit in the back of the classroom. You guys get up and tell your stories. And they do. And stories of torture and terror and violence and abuse of every imaginable kind. And honest to God, if their stories had been flames, you'd have to keep your distance. Otherwise, you'd get scorched. I would not have survived a single day of their childhoods. So the nighttime comes, and they get up just like these two guys, and then we're not going to have a Q&A period tonight, but we did then, and so I did my thing, and then they got up and stood on either side of me, and they did good jobs, for as terrified as they were to speak to this large crowd. So I did my thing, and I invited them up, and questions. Yes, ma'am. And a woman stands, and she says, I got a question. It's for Mario. First question out the gates for Mario. And Mario's a kind of a tall, skinny drink of water, and he walks up to the microphone, he clutches it tightly, and he says, yes. And he's just terrified, and 1,000 people. And she says, well, you say you're a father, and you have a son and a daughter, they're about to enter their teenage years. What wisdom do you impart to them? What advice do you give them? Well, Mario closes his eyes, and I can feel like he's starting to tremble, and he's getting a friggin' hernia trying to come up with whatever the hell he's going to say. And then when suddenly he blurts out, as soon as he says those two words, he rushes back to his microphone clutching, closed-eyed refuge. And now I know he's losing his battle with his tears. I just don't want my kids to turn out to be like me. Well, there's silence. And then the woman who asked the question stands, and now it's her turn to cry, and she says, "Why wouldn't you want your kids to turn out to be like you? You are loving, you are kind, you are gentle, you are wise. I hope your kids turn out to be like you." And 1,000 total perfect strangers stand, and they will not stop clapping. And all Mario can do is hold his face in his hand, so overwhelmed that this room full of strangers had returned him to himself. And trust me, everybody standing, they were returned to themselves, which shouldn't surprise us, because the feeling's mutual. And I think that's the only praise our exhausted God has any interest in. So church is not the place you come to, it's the place you go from, and you stand at the margins, because what awaits you there are your trustworthy guides, widow, orphan, stranger. And you look in each other's eyes and you say, "Oh, nobly born, remember who you are." And with breathless delight you say, "You're here, you're here." And the soul feels its worth, and pretty soon you cease to care whether anyone accuses you of wasting your time as you stand at the margins. For in this place of which you say it is a waste, there will be heard again the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voices of those who sing. We don't go to the margins to rescue anybody, but go figure. If we all go there, we all find rescue. Thank you very much. I'm exhausted.
It's hot in here.
Thank you.